Intrapersonal effects of closure needs. As epistemic motivations, the various closure needs form part and parcel of an individual's experience, as private and up-close and personal as such experience can get. Indeed, many of the effects of needs for closure occur proximally and determine individuals' psychological reactions to their informational environments. Such reactions can often, though not invariably, have a social psychological flavor. In the present chapter, I specifically review need for closure studies on social and non-social phenomena treated at the intra-individual level of analysis. These encompass events transpiring within the individual's mind, including personal perceptions, cognitions, and feelings. What often imbues such phenomena with a social psychological significance is that to an appreciable extent they deal with other people. As a social species, we passionately observe, wonder, and have feelings about others. We are interested and intrigued in the kinds of persons they are. We probe their values and opinions, assess their capabilities and motivations, and ponder their fates and personal histories. Need for closure theory is relevant to such phenomena in two interrelated ways having to do with 1. The extent of processing information about others, and 2. The tendency to weigh some such information more than others. As noted in previous chapters, the present theory suggests that in forming judgments about others, one will seek less information before 59. Crystallizing an impression if one experiences at the moment a heightened need for a non-specific closure. By contrast, the extent of information processing under a high need for a specific closure should depend on the content of the early information. If it is desirable, information processing should be curtailed, whereas if it is undesirable, it should be prolonged. Let us consider now some empirical evidence bearing on such hypotheses. Non-specific effects. Restriction of predecisional search for information was examined in a study by Webster, Richter, and Kruglanski, 1996, which manipulated need for closure via mental fatigue. Specifically, fatigue was expected to raise the need for closure, as mentally fatigued individuals should seek closure to avoid further information processing that may appear laborious, and hence subjectively costly to those persons. Psychology students carried out an impression formation task in which each played a personnel manager faced with a hiring decision. Students were randomly assigned to complete the task either before or after a normal class period, or following a final examination. Those conditions were designed to produce low and high degrees of mental fatigue, respectively. Manipulation checks provided evidence that the fatigue induction was successful, that is, participants tested either before or after a normal class reported a lower degree of fatigue than those tested after the final examination, and b. Fatigue varied positively with the need for closure. The higher the need for closure is indexed by various checks, the higher the fatigue. As part of the impression formation task, participants were presented with a list of materials often used in the evaluation of job applicants and were asked to indicate which of those items they would like to review prior to their own evaluation of the candidate. The list consisted of a variety of relevant items, including resume, answers, transcripts, and a personal statement. Information about the number of pages involved in each document was also provided. As expected, individuals experiencing a relatively high versus low need for closure requested significantly fewer pages of relevant information prior to forming their impression of the job candidate. Furthermore, when some participants were held accountable for their judgments, a manipulation designed to lower their need for closure, they requested significantly more pages of information than those who were not held accountable. The extent of information processed en route to knowledge formation was also examined in an earlier experiment by Maeslas and Kruglanski, 1987, Study 2. Participants identified barely visible digits appearing on a screen of a tachistoscope. Need for closure was heightened for some participants by informing them that mental concentration and intelligence are positively correlated with the ability to form unambiguous, clear-cut opinions. Those instructions were designed to heighten the need for closure by enhancing the perceived value of closure. The need to avoid closure was aroused in other participants with accuracy instructions and the promise of extra experimental credits for correctly identifying 9 out of 10 digits. Those instructions were designed to increase participants' tolerance of ambiguity and their propensity to entertain various possibilities regarding a digit's identity. A neutral control condition was also included in which no motivational induction was attempted. All participants were given the opportunity to operate the tachistoscope an unlimited number of times. Results indicated that, as expected, the extent of informational search, operationally defined as the number of times participants operated the tachistoscope, was lowest in the need for closure condition, intermediate in the control condition, and highest in the need to avoid closure conditions. Specific closure effects. The extent of information processing is often affected by the desirability of the specific closure implied by the early evidence. Where such a closure is desirable, e.g., where one's research supports one's favorite hypothesis, or where one's annual checkup eventuates in a clean bill of health, one's tendency may be to stop information processing right there and then, and accept the desirable conclusion as valid. However, should the implied conclusion turn out to be threatening, unpleasant, or otherwise undesirable, one's tendency may often be to resist the undesirable conclusion and engage in a vigorous search for further information, hopefully capable of overturning the negative news. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, 1969, page 38, cited in Ditto and Lopez, 1992, page 568, wrote in this context about the reactions of a patient just informed of her terminal condition. The first reaction is typically disbelief and the assumption that an unfortunate mix-up must have occurred. This is often followed by an extensive search for additional opinions and further professional counsel. Resignation to the sad news is the last phase and it comes after a lengthy effort to prove it incorrect. Ditto and Lopez, 1992, Study 1, conducted research to investigate the relation between desirability of information and the extent of its processing. In one experiment, participants assessed which of two students was more intelligent, expecting to subsequently work with the student they had judged as the more intelligent. One of the students was portrayed as likable and the other one as unlikable. The assessment was to be made on the basis of the student's prior performance, which was made available to the research participants. It was found that participants required less information to determine that a dislikable student was less intelligent than that he was more intelligent. That is, where the initial information suggested that the dislikable target was intelligent, participants considered significantly more information to accept that conclusion as valid than where the initial information suggested that the dislikable target was unintelligent. In another study, Ditto and Lopez, 1992, Study 2, provided some participants with information that they suffered from a fictitious medical condition called TA enzyme deficiency, whereas other participants were told they did not suffer from this particular deficiency. It was found that participants led to believe that they suffered from the deficiency took significantly longer on the average to decide that their TA test was complete, hence that its results were informative, than did the no deficiency participants. Hypothesis generation. As we try to arrive at a judgment or to form an opinion, we often generate a number of alternative hypotheses to account for known facts, and proceed to choose among them on the basis of further relevant information. Imagine a wife trying to interpret her husband's unusually complimentary remarks. Could it be that he is trying to win her over to a plan she has long opposed, e.g., concerning a costly trip abroad in the company of his buddies? Could it be that his satisfaction at work is spilling over, given that his long-awaited promotion just came through? Could it be that a death of a close friend reminded him of the brevity of life and inspired him to count his blessings and appreciate what he has? Could it be all of the above? The seizing and freezing tendencies evoked by the need for non-specific, closure may appreciably affect the tendency to keep generating such alternative hypotheses versus curtailing their generation relatively early on. The relationship between the need for closure and hypothesis generation was specifically examined in an experiment by Maeslas and Kruglansky, 1987, Study 3. Participants were shown photos of parts of common objects, such as a comb or a toothbrush. These photos were enlarged and taken from unusual angles to disguise their true identity. On each of several trials, participants listed as many hypotheses as possible concerning an object's identity and finally selected what they deemed as the most likely identity. Need for closure was aroused in some participants by stressing that clear-cut opinions are related to intelligence and mental concentration. Need to avoid closure was induced in other participants by informing them that mental concentration and intelligence are related to correct visual recognition. A neutral condition was also included in which no motivational induction was attempted. As expected, results indicated that participants in the need to avoid closure condition generated more hypotheses on the average than participants in the neutral control condition, whereas participants in the need for closure condition generated fewer hypotheses on the average than did the control group. Specific closure effects. It is easy to extrapolate the logic of specific closure needs to the phenomenon of hypothesis generation. Specifically, the more motivationally desirable the early hypotheses are that come to one's mind, the fewer alternative hypotheses one might generate. To the contrary, the less motivationally desirable the early hypotheses, the greater the number of alternative hypotheses one might generate. Imagine a male whose overriding specific need was ego enhancement. Imagine further that an attractive female coworker at the office just smiled at our protagonist. If the first explanation that came to his mind was that she found him appealing, he may well cease generating further explanations and accept the current one as fact because it was so pleasing and satisfactory. On the other hand, if the first explanatory hypothesis that popped into this person's mind for some reason was that she is ingratiating because of his status and power, he may continue generating further explanatory possibilities, finding the current explanation rather disappointing. Consistent with this analysis, in research by Ditto and Lopez, 1992, Study 3, all participants were presented with information that they possessed a fictitious TAR enzyme, but the healthfulness of this alleged condition was varied. Some participants were informed that TAR presence was healthy as it reduces the likelihood of a pancreatic disease. Other participants were informed that the TAR presence was unhealthy as it increases the likelihood of such a disease. The main dependent variable was the amount of recent irregularities in participants' lives they cited as potentially biasing the test results. It was found, as expected, that participants given the unhealthy diagnosis generated a significantly greater number of such biasing factors, hence producing more numerous alternative explanations of the test results than participants given the healthy diagnosis. Ditto, Sipansky, Monroe, Apanovich, and Lockhart, 1998, Study 3. Drew one further, intriguing derivation from the notion that individuals will engage in an extensive informational search if the initial data returns should yield an undesirable conclusion, or specific closure. Specifically, such research indicates that the individuals may not arrive at desirable conclusions on a whim. Rather, in order to accept them, they need to ground them in subjectively compelling evidence. One implication of such an assumption is that the search for further evidence may fail, after all, to yield the desired preference-consistent information, in which case the negative conclusions would have to be accepted whether one liked it or not. Participants in the Ditto et al. 1998, Study 3, research were all informed that they tested positive for the TAR enzyme. However, whereas half the participants were led to believe this was good news because the enzyme fulfills a positive function, reducing the likelihood of a pancreatic disease, the remaining half were led to believe it was bad news because the enzyme is detrimental to one's health, increasing the likelihood of a pancreatic disease. Participants were then offered an alternative explanation for why the test yielded the result that it did. They were told, specifically, that false readings could sometimes be caused by unusually high or low blood sugar levels. Some participants were informed that such false readings are reasonably likely, and others that they are possible but unlikely. It was found that when the TED was portrayed in positive terms, the probability of the alternative interpreter TED of the test results did not make a difference. In other words, the favorable diagnosis was perceived as equally accurate irrespective of the probability of the alternative interpretation. By contrast, where the diagnosis was unfavorable, i.e., when the TED was portrayed in negative terms, the probability of the alternative interpretation did matter. When such explanation was depicted as probable, participants rated the test as rather inaccurate, but when it was depicted as improbable, participants rated the test as accurate despite the negative implications of such a judgment for their future health. The non-complementarity effect. The non-complementarity effect refers to a tendency to ignore the implications that changes in one interdependent component of a conceptual system have for the remaining components. For example, in judging the likelihood of each alternative in a set of mutually exclusive and exhaustive alternatives, people often vitiate the fundamental mathematical assumption that the probabilities in such a set must sum up to unity. Thus, when the probability of one alternative is altered on the basis of evidence, the probability of the remaining alternatives isn't adjusted appropriately. Robinson and Hastie, 1985, Sambomatsu, Posavac, Kardes, and Mantel, 1998, Sambomatsu, Posavac, and Stasny, 1997, Van Volendal, 1989, Van Volendal and Hastie, 1990. Non-complementarity may be observed in other interdependent conceptual systems as well, such as market share estimation. For example, information that influences the estimates of market share for one firm may have no effect on subjective market share estimates of competing firms. This is true despite the logical interdependencies and the constant sum nature of market shares, whereby if the market share of one firm increases or decreases, the market shares of the remaining firms must decrease or increase complementarily. Recently, Houghton and Kardes, 1998, argued that such non-complementarity effects might represent an instance of seizing and freezing under a heightened need for non-specific closure. Specifically, under need for closure, the estimator may restrict his consideration of a focal alternative, that is, seize and freeze upon the implications of the evidence for changes in that alternative, and fail to consider what implications these have for the remaining alternatives. In a study designed to test these ideas, Houghton and Kardes, 1998, had participants estimate market shares with limited information. Specifically, information for the year 1992 was provided about R&D, research and development, expenditures, assets, and profits relative to the industry averages with regard to a focal firm, Horn Industries, and 3 to 7 other companies. The participants considered this information and then provided market share estimates for the focal and the alternative companies. Subsequently, participants were told that, in the beginning of 1994, Horn Industries, the focal company, was implementing a change in strategy. Specifically, Horn was increasing or decreasing R&D expenditures, or increasing, decreasing sales force size. Houghton and Kardes, 1998, page 315. Participants were then asked to estimate the market share for Horn Industries as well as for the remaining, non-focal, firms. The main dependent variable of interest was the degree to which participants with high versus low need for cognitive closure, as assessed by Webster and Kruglanski's 1994 need for closure scale, revised their estimates in regard to the focal versus the non-focal companies. As predicted, the non-complementarity effect was significantly more pronounced when participants' need for closure was high versus low. The non-complementarity effect was also significantly reduced when the number of alternative companies was high, 7, versus low, 3. presumably because the greater the number of the alternatives, the greater their saliency. Tversky and Kohler, 1994. Houghton and Cuddy, 1998, summarized these results by noting that myopic reasoning processes in managerial judgment and decision-making are especially likely in industries comprised of a relatively small set of competing firms, or when concerns about closure, due to individual differences in decision-making styles or due to situational pressures, is high. Page 319. Specific closure effects. The differential tendency to attend to the focal versus the alternative entities underlying the non-complementarity effect might be affected also by needs for specific closure. Specifically, the concentration of attention on the focal alternative, and hence the non-complementarity effect, might be greater if that alternative was of particular concern to the estimator. In a market share estimation paradigm, this might be so if the focal alternative represented the estimator's own firm, or if the implied shift in market share due to the new information was particularly desirable to the estimator, e.g., it represented an important increase versus a decrease in profits. Similarly, the non-complementarity effect might be reduced if desirability considerations shifted the estimator's attention to the non-focal alternatives. These possibilities could be explored in future research. Subjective confidence. An ironic consequence of reduced hypothesis generation before forming a judgment may be heightened subjective confidence despite limited consideration of alternatives. If individuals under high need for closure are less aware of competing judgmental possibilities, they may be more confident that the possibility they select is the correct one. Indeed, elevated judgmental confidence under heightened need for closure has been manifest in numerous studies that operationally defined this particular motivation in a variety of ways, such as via instructions stressing the desirability of voicing clear-cut opinions, Maeslas and Kruglanski, 1987, via time pressure, Kruglanski and Webster, 1991, by varying the interestingness, dullness of the judgmental task, Webster, 1993, and by increasing the difficulty of information processing by introducing environmental noise, Kruglanski, Webster, and Clem, 1993. These findings suggest that attainment of subjective certainty is indeed possible in the absence of extensive information processing. In fact, our research demonstrates that the restriction of information processing under heightened need for closure often goes hand in hand with elevated confidence. These findings echo the everyday observation that true believers, ideologues, and various authoritarian types are often extremely confident in their opinions as well as intolerant of alternative views. Cf. Jost, Glaser, Kruglanski, and Soloway, 2003 A. B. However, while one might have surmised that the dismissal of alternative views follows the commitment to one's chosen opinion, the present analysis implies the opposite causal sequence, whereby the arrested generation of alternatives, possibly due to enhanced need for cognitive closure, enhances one's confidence in the hypotheses that one did generate. Specific closure effects. The implications for confidence of the needs for a specific closure are readily inferable. If the early hypotheses were congruent with one's wishes, one would likely abstain from generating alternative hypotheses, and hence end up with a high degree of confidence that these hypotheses are valid. By contrast, if the early hypotheses ran counter to one's wishes, one may confront them quickly with competing alternatives, undermining the confidence in those unpleasant possibilities. I am unaware of research specifically looking at these phenomena. Their probing might thus need to be undertaken by future work. Type of information sought. The suppression of hypothesis generation under a high need for closure, Maeslas and Kruglanski, 1987, Study 3, may also affect the type of information sought, not merely its amount. This notion was specifically examined in a study, Kruglanski and Maeslas, 1988, that required participants to evaluate whether a target person belonged to a given professional category. Individuals under high need for closure were expected to prefer prototypical information about the category, e.g., information on whether the individual possessed the prototypical features of an architect, interest in visual aesthetics, mathematical ability, creativity, elegant lifestyle, while attempting to test the focal hypothesis that she was an architect. By contrast, individuals experiencing a need to avoid closure were expected to prefer diagnostic information, Trope and Basak, 1983, capable of discriminating among different possibilities regarding the target's professional affiliation. For example, when testing the focal hypothesis that a target is an architect, a person under high need to avoid closure might generate the competing alternative that she might be a painter instead, and proceed to seek diagnostic information with regard to the architect versus the painter possibilities. Thus, ANOVA might prefer information about mathematical ability and elegant lifestyle, presumed characteristic of architects but not of painters, rather than information about creativity and interest in visual aesthetics, presumed common to both. Indeed, the results of the Kruglansky and Maisler's 1988 research indicated that participants under high need for closure were more likely to seek information about prototypical features of the professional category, whereas participants under need to avoid closure were more likely to seek diagnostic information. The restriction of hypothesis generation under high need for nonspecific closure implies that high need for closure individuals may be less creative than their low need for closure counterparts. In support of this notion, recent work by Rocchi, 1998, found that Italian participants' high versus low on a dispositional need for closure generated figures and objects rated as less creative by external observers. This and other similar work is described in greater detail later. Specific closure effects. Again, it is easy to extrapolate these findings to specific closure effects. Consider a situation where the focal hypothesis tested by ANOVA was agreeable to this individual, hence representing a desired closure. For instance, the person may be testing the pleasant hypothesis that a new acquaintance genuinely likes her. Because of its agreeable nature, the tendency to generate alternatives to that hypothesis is likely to be weak. As a consequence, ANOVA is likely to seek out prototypical information having to do with evidence of genuine liking by the other. Did he smile at me? Did she indicate an interest in further encounters? Did he respond positively to my initiative in this domain? Imagine, by contrast, that the person is testing the disagreeable hypothesis that the new acquaintance's somber expression reflects repulsion or disdain toward ANOVA. The latter might be motivated, indeed, to engender several alternatives to such an unpleasant possibility. For example, ponder whether the individual in question may not be feeling ill, whether she may not be reacting to some bad news she may have received, or whether she is not generally timid and withdrawn, all of which would explain his gruff manner during the encounter. The presence of such alternative hypotheses would prompt the search for diagnostic information capable of demarcating them from the focal alternative. The timidity withdrawal hypothesis, for example, would imply the value of observing the target's behavior toward other new acquaintances. If she is indiscriminately gruff to others as well, the personal dislike hypothesis would be refuted. The illness or bad news hypotheses would imply the value of observing the target's behavior toward oneself and or others, in alternative situations not presume. Ably characterized by the unfortunate features associated with the initial encounter, cf. Kelly, 1967. 1Q utilization. Nonspecific closure effects. As noted earlier, under a heightened need for a nonspecific closure, an individual may experience dual psychological tendencies, a sense of urgency about forming closure, and a desire for maintaining closure once it had been formed. The urgency tendency should dispose persons to quickly seize upon early cues and utilize them toward the formation of initial judgments. And the permanence tendency should dispose them to freeze, or to fixate or perseverate on those particular judgments. Substantial research on a variety of seemingly diverse social psychological topics has found support for these ideas. Primacy effects in impression formation. A striking example of such effects is the classic primacy effect in impression formation. Order effects in impression formation, of which the primacy effect is an example, have long been of substantial interest to social psychologists, perhaps because they tellingly illustrate how the psychology of social judgments deviates from the dictates of pure reason. There is nothing, after all, in an item's location in the informational sequence, e.g., whether it comes early, late, or in the middle of an informational string, that should logically bear on its relevance, weight, or importance to the judgment being made. Yet order effects have been pervasively documented in social psychological studies, beginning with research by pioneers such as Ash, 1946, or Luchans and Luchans, 1950, and continuing to the present, Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, Webster, Richter, and Kruglanski, 1996. As implied above, a primacy effect refers to the tendency to base one's social impressions on early information about that person, to the relative neglect of subsequent, equally relevant information. Thus, if the early information about a person was positive, whereas the subsequent information was more negative, a primacy effect would be revealed if the overall impression of that person ended up being positive on the whole. Similarly, if the early information was negative and it was followed by positive information, an overall negative judgment would indicate the presence of a primacy effect as well. From the present perspective, primacy effects exemplify the seizing and freezing tendencies assumed to be manifest under a heightened need for closure. In such a motivational state, an individual may quickly grasp the early information and fixate on the judgment it implies, becoming relatively unaffected by, or impervious to, subsequent information that, objectively speaking, warrants being taken into account. If our analysis is correct, the magnitude of primacy effects should be augmented under a heightened need for non-specific closure. This prediction was first supported in an experiment by Kruglanski and Freund, 1983, Study 1. In that study, need for closure was heightened for some participants via a time pressure manipulation designed to highlight the benefits of early closure, and reduced for the other participants via accountability instructions, TEDTalk, 1985, designed to highlight the costs of premature closure. As expected, the magnitude of the primacy effect varied positively with time pressure and negatively with accountability. This effect has been replicated in several studies that operationally defined the need for closure in diverse ways, including, again, time pressure, Freund, Kruglanski, and Skapitzer. J. Zen, 1985, Heaton and Kruglanski, 1991, Requests for Global or Indiffer. Initiated Impressions, Freund, Kruglanski, and Skapitzer, 1985, or Scores on the Need for Closure Scale, Webster and Kruglanski, 1994. Finally, in a study referred to earlier, Webster, Richter, and Kruglanski, 1996, operationalized the need for non-specific closure via a mental fatigue induction and found that markedly stronger primacy effects were exhibited by fatigued participants than by their non-fatigued counterparts.